We go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. This is Rebecca Power. I will be your moderator for the day for The Current, the North Central Region Water Network's Speed Networking webinar series. The network is a university extension-led collaboration among land-grant universities in 12 upper Midwestern states. And we have a great presentation for you this afternoon. The title of the presentation is Cover Crops for Healthy Soils, Water Quality and Water Availability. And we have three great presenters. Eileen Kladivko from Purdue University. She's going to be talking about cover crops to improve water quality. Dean Baas from Michigan State University will be talking about cover crops to improve water quantity in cropped fields. And then finally, Anna Morrow, also from Purdue University, will be talking about using the Midwest Cover Crop Council Cover Crop Selector tool. The way that this works is we'll ask ask participants to submit questions in the chat box, and you can find that chat box in the lower left-hand portion of your screen. And we will have a dedicated question and answer session after all of our presenters are through. The presentations will be about 10 minutes each, so we hope to have plenty of time for questions at the end. With that, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Eileen Kladivko, who is a professor of agronomy at Purdue, and she teaches and does research and extension work in soil physics, soil biology, and soil management. She's done a lot of work on cover crops, earthworms, no-till, drainage, many practices that it takes to have agriculture be healthy, vibrant, and sustainable in the upper Midwest. So welcome, Eileen.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm pleased to kick off this afternoon's webinar and talk about cover crops and how they can improve water quality, obviously in a very brief fashion. But before I talk about the impacts of cover crops on water quality, I want to remind us all of what the rationale is for growing cover crops, whether it's for water quality or other purposes. And it's basically to have a living, growing plant at times of the year when we normally have nothing growing, particularly in our summer annual cropping systems of corn and soybeans in the Midwest, for example. So these living, growing plants are going to capture sunlight and photosynthesize and feed soil organisms with exudates, sequester carbon, trap and recycle nutrients, improve overall soil biological activity and soil health, and basically make better use of the time and the resources that we have in our systems. To look at a photo to kind of illustrate that, this was the Purdue agronomy farm several years ago, corn and soybean plots, and then a grass strip in the middle, not a cover crop plot, just the ordinary grass alleyway. And you can see that this was early September this year, and the corn and the soybeans were harvested, and those plots are brown. So you've got brown fields all September, October, November, all winter, all March, most of April. Whereas the grass strip, green and growing, photosynthesizing, exuding carbon, feeding those organisms, trapping and recycling nutrients. So again, our rationale is to make better use of whatever growing season that we do have to improve water quality as well as any of the other benefits that we might want from cover crops. But cover crops are not a simple cookbook practice that we can just throw on the field and say now it's going to improve water quality or do anything else that we want. They are part of a system, and there are different potential benefits and challenges for every type of cover crop that we might choose. And Anna's going to talk a little bit later about choosing cover crops. But certainly farmers need to adapt their cropping system, including potentially nutrient management or pest management or tillage or no tillage management and so on. And there's a learning curve. Whether it's a farmer, a researcher, an extension person, a conservationist, there is a learning curve to effectively integrating cover crops into our systems. And really it's part of our responsibility when we're working with folks to not overlook the learning curve for us as well as for them. There are three main categories of cover crops that we tend to use in the Midwest. They all have different effects, different challenges, different benefits. And Anna will talk about the Selector tool to help with that. But again, we have grasses such as cereal rye, annual ryegrass, oats. We have brassicas such as the daikon radish, and then we have legumes such as crimson clover. So when we're looking at water quality, a lot of times the grasses can be very, very effective, but the others have their place as well. Cereal rye tends to be the cover crop that is most often chosen throughout the north central region because it's the most winter hardy and most widely adaptable across the northern region. It can be planted later than just about anything else. It survives the winter if it gets established at all, and so it tends to be the most common cover crop that we see across the region. So when we talk about the impacts of cover crops on water quality, a lot of times we forget to mention that, oh, by the way, these impacts have been measured on grass cover crops, and there is less data and it's maybe a little less definitive on some of the other cover crops. So we all just need to kind of remind ourselves when we're talking about impacts that we specify which cover crops we are talking about. While we are emphasizing right now nitrate with Gulf of Mexico hypoxia and so on, we also need to remember that one of the biggest impacts of cover crops is the classic purpose of cover crops, which is to cover the soil to reduce erosion, sediment still being one of our major contaminants of waterways. So that classic purpose is to cover the soil, reduce erosion. This is some work from Tom Casper in Iowa that kind of reiterates that. On the left, you see no cover crop. They did rainfall simulation in the spring, and you can see quite a bit of erosion there. You can see the wheel track, in fact. In the middle was a oat cover crop, so good oat growth in the fall, and then it dies as expected. But the erosion in the spring was cut in half by that cover from the oat cover crop. And on the right was cereal rye, which grew in the fall, then went dormant, then started growing again in the spring, and the erosion was cut even further than the oats. So the bottom line is you have a good grass cover crop. You're going to be able to reduce erosion, and even if it's dead, but even better if it's alive. The legume cover crops also are fairly effective if you get enough growth. The brassicas might actually loosen the soil enough if they're grown by themselves to make the soil more erodible, and that's one reason that most of us don't recommend brassicas by themselves as a cover crop, but so a radish should be mixed with oats or rye or something else so that the soil does not become too erodible. You've seen this slide before, but what I've added now is the whole nature of having something living and growing for a longer period of time. Tile drain studies in the Midwest have consistently shown reductions in nitrate leaching with cover crops, and I'm going to give you a small amount of data from two different locations, one in Indiana and one in Iowa. And when I'm talking with farmers, I emphasize that scavenged nitrogen, so the 20 or 30 pounds that they kept out of the tile drain, is going into their soil nitrogen bank account. They may not retrieve it this year, but at some point that nitrogen will come back as soil organic matter has been built up. So this is my long-term drainage research site in southeastern Indiana at the CPIC site. And what we have here on the vertical axis is nitrate nitrogen concentration in milligrams per liter or parts per million. And remember that 10 is the drinking water standard. And then this was the first 15 years of my now 30-year study. So just to give you some idea of what our concentrations were. So during that first time period, we were growing continuous corn. The CC here is for continuous corn, not cover crop. Putting on 250 pounds of nitrogen pre-plant as anhydrous ammonia, and a little bit of starter as well. And that was the extension recommendation at the time in the early to mid-80s for a 200 bushel corn crop. And you can see that our concentrations were in that 20 to 35 part per million range. High, but the typical concentration range at that time in the Midwest. By about 1989, extension recommendations had changed, and so now we were putting on 200 pounds of nitrogen for continuous corn, and our concentrations dropped, although we still have year-to-year variations with crop yield. A poor crop yield in 88 led to high concentrations in 89 because there was a lot of residual nitrate. And then in 1994, we started with a corn-soybean rotation and no-till and started using a trap crop or cover crop just every other year after we were using, at that time we were using winter wheat as a trap crop after corn to tie up residual nitrogen after the corn year. And because we are now in a corn-soybean rotation, we could reduce our fertilizer rate further because of the soybean credit, basically. So we're at 155 pounds of nitrogen per acre plus 20 to 25 starter. And you can see that our concentrations are at or below this 10 part per million range now. So we're consistently getting that reduced concentration, cover crops being very effective. If you're awake, you may realize that, of course, I did a couple things at one time here. I reduced my fertilizer rate as well as incorporated a cover crop into the system, and that's the limitation of this study, is I can't separate out how much is due to the fertilizer change and how much is due to the cover crop change. And so that's why I'm going to now move to an Iowa study where it's clearer to see that difference. But certainly we know that our cover crop is doing part of our reduction there. And I'm going to skip this because I see I'm getting close on time. So Tom Casper out in Iowa has a nice cover crop study, just no cover crop versus cereal rye cover crop, no complication due to different fertilizer rates. And if you look at the last two bars, that's the average over that 15-year period or so. And you can see the red bar here is showing that the total concentration, the annual concentration in nitrate is less than half in the cover crop what it is in the no cover crop. And then if you multiply that out by the amount of drainage, you get the same thing. The total kilograms per hectare, or total loss from the field, is reduced by 60% when you go from no cover crop to a cereal rye cover crop. So again, a very, very significant impact shown consistently throughout the Midwest by tile drain studies when you get adequate growth. So my next to last slide is just how much impact could widespread adoption of cover crops have in the Midwest. Tom Casper and I and some other colleagues did an analysis of this. One way of doing an analysis, we looked at the 5 Midwestern states with large tile drain areas, and we included estimates of what we thought which acres could have relatively easy adoption based on their current cropping management practices. And we could debate all day about whether you agree with our assessment of what's relatively easy or not, but we used the root zone water quality model to predict the reduction in nitrate losses, and basically found that in what I would consider a fairly conservative approach, nearly 20% reduction in nitrate load to the Mississippi River out of our goal of 45%. So very, very significant reduction with this one practice alone, which again to us suggests that we need to pay a lot more attention to getting cover crops, in this case it was a cereal rye cover crop, adopted across wide acreages in the Midwest. So my last slide is just a prelude to some of the tools that the Midwest Cover Crops Council has, and Anna will be talking about the Selector tool that is on our website later on. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll move on to Dean, I think.
Great, Eileen, thank you so much for that introduction. And yes, we'll move right on to Dean Baas, who is an extension educator in sustainable agriculture for Michigan State University Extension. And as you can imagine, he is also involved in cover crop, soil health, and organic agriculture research and education. I will, without further ado, go ahead and let Dean present, and you can see the rest of his information there. So thank you, Dean, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to talk about cover crops and water quantity. And really the major questions that come about when we talk about cover crops and water quality is, how do cover crops contribute to or detract from water quantity? And do they conserve water or use water in dry years? And do they conserve water in wet years? And then also, how can they impact increasing resiliency to extreme climate events? And since we don't have a lot of time, I picked one study to talk about those first two questions. It's work done by Andrea Baas and Tom Casper and others at Iowa that was published in Agriculture Water Management. And they did some work over a long period of time. They looked at rye cover crop effect on plant available water. The rye cover crop was in a corn-soybean rotation, and it had been in that rotation for 12 years. They studied the water in this system for the last 7 years of the study. I'm going to start with their conclusions, and then we'll get into a little bit of data to talk about maybe some more important details. But they found that a rye cover crop increased water storage, that's plant available water, in the top 30 centimeters by 18%. And that's the equivalent to an extra 3/4 of a centimeter of water every time the upper 30 centimeters of soil was re-wetted with rainfall. And that's really important. It's not a one-time storage event. As that water is depleted, you get that extra back every time you get an event. So keep that in mind when we look at the data. The rye cover crop does use water in the spring, but they found in 5 out of 7 years this was replenished by the time of the main crop planting. In 2 out of 7 it was not. In most years after the cover crop termination, the water contents in the upper 30 centimeters were higher following the rye cover crop in the summer. So this is one of the graphs that represents kind of typically what they saw in those 5 out of 7 years where the water was replaced. The volumetric water content of the soil is here on the left axis. On the right is precipitation, which is represented by the vertical bars. The dotted line is no cover crop, and the solid green line is cover crop. You can see here where the cover crop is using available water prior to termination and even for a short period after. This is where the cover crop was terminated. But then this series of rain events here replenished the system, so by the time we got to planting, they were back at the normal level. But you do see this water use by the cover crop, and under extreme conditions, if you don't get some events prior to planting, you could be at a lower level with the cover crops. Now if you look at the 2 years, it had this type of pattern where you have the cover crop water use. This is where they planted soybeans. You can see you're at a much lower water content, volumetric water content with the cover crop. But in the cases that they had, within a week to 10 days, a rain event was received that recharged things and brought things back up to the level which was similar to not having the cover crop. And in many cases, it exceeded. We'll be looking at some summer numbers, and you can see how there's more water holding capacity. Also note here, early on, you have more water with the cover crop than with the no cover crop situation. So this is during one of the dry summers, 2012, which was a dry summer. Coming into it, they were pretty similar, and as water was being used with these events, they continued to have more water with the cover crop versus the no cover crop. And I think this is where it gets more impressive, is when you get a major event, you've got considerably more water being retained by the fields that have the cover crop versus the ones that do not. They come down a similar slope, but you've got more stored water. And that's getting to be more and more important, because you look at the severity of this event, how big that precipitation event was, and the difference you see here is the loss of stored water. That additional water was not retained in the soil and probably ran off because of the inability of the soil to hold that water, and the cover crop soil was able to hold that water. Now, in a wet summer, which we've had some of those as well, you can definitely see how the cover crop is holding more soil water than the no cover crop. Under wet conditions, it may not be, there may not be that big advantage to yield and things like that, but with the variability in the climate that we're seeing these days, you don't know if you're going to get the wet year or the dry year. Cover crops and soil organic matter and water quantity. We know that soil organic matter increases the water holding capacity. This is work that was done by Hudson. It depends a little on the type of soil that you have, but you can see for the sand, it's roughly for every 1% increase in soil organic matter, you can hold about half a centimeter more in the top 25 centimeters of the soil. And it's about 0.6 here for the other soils to 0.7, and that equates to about 1/4 of an inch additional moisture. Now again, I reemphasize that that's not just a one-time deal. It's something that you take advantage of as the soil water content goes down and gets replenished. You get to use that over again. It doesn't sound like a lot, but if you work out the numbers, there's been some people who have done some calculations on it, and it turns out that 1% soil organic matter can hold approximately 20,000 gallons of water in an acre. So it is a considerable amount of water. I wanted to talk real briefly about the resiliency thing. This is some data on the Midwest and what's going on with precipitation. This map shows the increasing amount of precipitation falling in very heavy events. That's defined as the heaviest 1% of all daily events, and this is from 1958 to 2012. The trends that are shown here, the Midwest is 37% heavier precipitation. You can see the Northeast is 71%, but these are significantly higher than the natural variation for the Midwest, the Northeast, and the Southeast. They are not for the Northwest or the Southwest. Those are with the 5% and 12%, and those are within the natural variation. But this shows that, you know, we are getting heavier precipitation. Here's another representation of it. This shows the change in the number of days that have had greater than 1 1/4 inch of precipitation. And what this shows is if you've got, say, 2 days extra, there are 2 more days at the end of the period as compared to the beginning of the period. Now you can see that you've got some that are increases, some are decreases, and some are holding the same. But that's one of the things we're faced with nowadays, is we don't know where these changes are going to start occurring. Just within Michigan this past year, we've got counties that are now disaster areas because of heavy precipitation. I think it's 7 counties in Michigan, where the rest of them are not, and we actually have some areas that are still at a deficit. So it's not a large statewide effect currently. It seems to be more localized, so you don't know where you're going to win or who's going to get it. Just a quick look at the Palmer Drought Severity Index. You can see that that's the long-term trend line on that is sloping upward. And so on the other end of the spectrum, probably one of the surveys that's been quoted the most is the CPIC survey for 2012, which was a drought year. And their farmer survey said that on average for corn they got 9.6% higher yield with a cover crop than without a cover crop. That they had, this was for cover crop growers who had been using them for at least 3 years, and on average 11% higher yield for soybeans in a drought year. So conclusions, long-term cover crop use can increase available water most years. Some years cover crops reduce available water at crop planting, but it is usually replaced during the season. One strategy, if you do have a dry spring and you are concerned about it, we recommend early termination. That can reduce cover crop water use. And cover crops increase soil organic matter, which increases available water holding capacity, which can improve resiliency in both wet and dry years. One of the things I like to point out to farmers is in a typical year for precipitation, cover crops may not, probably will not give you any added advantage for water quantity. But when you get in the extreme events, both on the wet end and the dry end, they can provide an advantage. So it's a little bit like crop insurance. You know, using cover crops just gives you more resiliencies for those extremes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, and thanks for those great concluding comments, as well as all the intriguing data. And just to point out, we know that these presentations are just a tease of what these researchers and educators have to offer, but that's the idea behind this speed networking webinar series, is that you get many of you, I think, know these folks, but if you get a taste for what they have to offer and you want to follow up with them and ask them additional questions on your own, you can go ahead and do that. And again, just a reminder that you will get the chance to ask them some questions during this webinar right after our next speaker. And our next speaker is Anna Morrow. She has served as the program manager for the Midwest Cover Crop Council for the past year, and hopefully she'll be with us for a while longer. She was previously with the Agriculture and Natural Resources Purdue Extension Educator in Franklin County for 3 years, and has a master's degree in agronomy from Purdue. So thanks so much, Anna, and take it away.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for joining. I'll just go ahead and get started with the Midwest Cover Crops Council. Our members are from Extension, federal and state agencies, non-governmental organizations, private sector, and then farmers, of course. And that's all across the 12 north central states and Ontario. And our goal is to help facilitate adoption of cover crops. So on the 2016 SARE cover crop survey that Dean had mentioned, farmers cited lacking information as being a very important limitation to cover crop adoption. So we think that there's a big need for more available extension education and that type of thing, and we're hoping to help fill some of that gap. Farmers also list seeding the right species for their operation as the third largest challenge behind establishment and time or labor restraints. We can't do much about giving you more time, but hopefully we can help with seeding the right species. Real quickly, I want to touch on our brand new website. It came up in December of last year, and hopefully you've had a chance to check it out. If not, please go and look around a little bit. I'm going to explain just a few of the new features that we have. On each of our state pages, we've listed local resources. I know they're a little small on this page, but we've got how you can find your Natural Resource Conservation Service, Extension, Soil and Water, and any other pertinent contacts, your state contacts for MCCC, and then what's going on in your state in terms of research and outreach. One thing I like to point out, I really like this Browse by Category box. If you select a category, in anything out of this box, you can read more on that topic. So it makes searching for information a little easier. We also have a search box up here in the top right-hand corner that's a little easier to find than our previous search box. So if you scroll down on every state's page or any of our topic pages, you'll see that we have extension publications listed kind of like posts. So you'll see here, this was taken from the Indiana page. We've got successful ryegrass termination, Goss's wilt, successful termination with herbicides. And so you can scroll through and see extension publications that apply to that specific web page. They are cross-reference between pages. So for example, the successful annual ryegrass termination, that will be found on the Indiana page because it comes from Purdue, the annual ryegrass page, and also the termination page. So you don't have to go hunting around quite as much. Hopefully we've got the information you need and made very easily available. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into our decision tool now. This is our main menu here across the top of the screen, and the selector tools are found here. So when you click the selector tools on the main menu, you've got row crop tools and vegetable crop tool. The vegetable crop tool is only available for Michigan right now. We're hoping to expand that and doing some work in that area. So if you click on the row crop tool, it will take you to the following page. We also have instructions on using the tool and a handy video from Walt Zell and Phil Woolery at Purdue that it helps to explain the decision tool. So this is our cover crop decision tool, and it doesn't look like much at the beginning, but we do ask you to enter your state and county, and that's because each list of cover crops is specialized by state, and then the planting date that we give you is determined by county. So we take 30-year climate averages based on county data and use that to determine seeding dates. So as soon as you enter a county, and I've entered Indiana and Gibson County just as an example, our seeding table comes up. And then from there, we have several other options that you can dive deeper into your cover crop selection. So the first question that we ask is, what's the cash crop? So you can enter any of these into that field, and then your planting and harvest date. And mostly the dates are what's most important in that section. And what that does is that gives you this blue bar over the seeding table so that you can recognize that, if there's a particular cover crop that you want to plant, just recognize that you have a cash crop in the field and that you'll have to do some type of interseeding or just work around that standing crop for whatever method you decide to use. So the next question on our selector tool is we ask you a little bit about drainage information. So what is the soil drainage type for your field? And depending on that, if you choose very poorly drained, there are going to be several species that drop off the list. So those will be grayed out of the list, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. That will help you with your selection of a cover crop. Next, you'll answer whether or not you have tile drainage. So if you have a very poorly tile drain or a very poorly drained soil, and you also have tile drainage, that corrects for that soil drainage class a little bit. And then finally, whether or not you have flooding, and is that brief or long, and that helps also select your cover crop. So the final selection tool that we have here is, what is your goal for using cover crops? You can see a whole list of goals here, everything from nitrogen source to good grazing, interseed with cash crop. And we have 3 fields for that, so you can enter 3 separate goals. Each list is the same. And once you do that, you will get a table that looks something like this. So just as an example, I've entered nitrogen scavenger, erosion fighter, and good grazing as goals for our cover crops. You can see that since we said nitrogen scavenger, all of these legumes have dropped off the list, and that's because they are ranked a 1 or less. So 0 is poor, 1 is fair, 2 is good, up to 4 being excellent. So the legumes have dropped off the list because they are not good nitrogen scavengers. Our second goal was erosion fighter, and Eileen mentioned about the brassicas not doing a very good job of that, so you can see that they have dropped out. You can still faintly see what their ratings are, but they've dropped out because of the erosion fighter qualities. So from here, this gives a farmer or a conservation professional an idea of what type of cover crop species might work for them. So they might say, well, winter cereal rye seems like a good option for me. And this is something that people tend to forget, I think, is that you can click on this cover crop name, winter cereal rye, and we will give you this information sheet. And that gives you everything from seeding rates, potential disadvantages, potential advantages, just lots of additional information on that specific species. So that's always a handy thing that you can print out for field days. It's just a 1-pager about specific species, and that's specific to your state. I'm running out of time, but I'd like to just show you quickly the difference between counties. So I've taken some counties in Ohio. This is Williams County, and if you just want to keep an eye on the green bars that show the seeding dates for those different species, Williams County is in northwest Ohio. And then we're going to switch to Erie County, which is up on the lake. So you can see that those green bars shifted, and that's showing us the lake effect on the climate in Erie County. And then next I'm going to just click down to south central Ohio, which this will be Lawrence County, and you can see it changes again just based on the climates of those 3 different counties. We're getting different seeding recommendations. So finally, I'd like to just point out a few other cover crop resources. They've been mentioned before. The Cover Crops Field Guide is put together by MCCC. You can find the link to purchase those on our website. We've got a link to the Managing Cover Crops Profitably Sayer book. We use a lot of that information. Your state resource pages, all that type of thing. And of course, if you're not already, please join our Listserv. That's on the main menu of our homepage. Lots of good information there. We've got several updates that are coming, and just join our Listserv so you can make sure and keep up to date with all the good things that are going on with Midwest Cover Crops Council. Thanks.
Great, thanks Anna, and thanks to all our presenters. And yeah, for those of you that are not on the Midwest Cover Crop Council Listserv, it's not an overload of email. It's just it's a good amount of good information. So with that, let's go ahead and get to questions from our participants. And For those of you still on the line with us here, feel free to enter your questions in the chat box and we will get to them in order. So the first question I think we had is for Eileen, and the question is, what accounts for the increases in N in, I think it was 1992, in your research, Eileen? And if you want to go ahead and page back to that, you can, or you can just answer that question.
Yes, basically, I didn't have time to go into all the details of all of those, but we had a drought in 1988, which led to the increase in 1989. We also had a drought in that area of Indiana in 1991, not quite as severe as 88, and so that led to the increase in concentration in 1992. So it was actually, yeah, I think I was pointing to that, although my pointer wasn't working. So yeah, basically you have year-to-year variations even as you change fertilizer rates, because if you have a low yield, obviously from one year, you've got that residual nitrogen. If you don't have a cover crop there to take it up, then that's going to lead to increases the next year. Most of our drain flow occurs in that location, occurs in November through April. So, and you know, we put our fertilizer on in the spring, so it's not because we put fertilizer on in the fall, but any residual nitrogen from that crop is going to start coming out in November, but the majority of it's going to be coming out in our location January, February, March, April of the following year. So drought of 91, low yield, made higher concentrations in 92.
Great, thank you, Eileen. And Jen, I'm sorry, I did not see your technical question there until now, so I hope that you have had the chance to resolve that. And Brian, if you see that, if you have any suggestions, feel free to go ahead and also put them in the chat. Next question is, how would you respond to some of the work by Dr. David Lobb and others in Manitoba that suggests that cover crop residues can result in an increase in dissolved phosphorus in cold climate regions when most of the runoff occurs as snowmelt?
Yeah, that's a little tougher question, and it's actually not just cover crop residues, it's any kind of crop residue. So, I mean, people have known for a long time that crop residues themselves, once they start to senesce, can leach nutrients. And so if you have cover crops in addition to a crop residue, you know, cash crop residue, then you may have some more nutrients that are available to be leached. I'm gonna start up front by saying I'm not totally up on the specifics of those particular studies, so I'm not going to be able to answer some of the details. I want to look at a little bit more at some of the details of what he's finding there. Certainly, we have the trade-off between dissolved phosphorus and sediment phosphorus, where we have cover on the soil, whether it's cash crop, no-till, cover crop. We generally drastically reduce sediment losses and sediment phosphorus. We have the potential to increase dissolved losses compared to bare soil. However, it's kind of it's very difficult to say, are you better off having more erosion and more sediment loss? I don't think so. Or having more dissolved loss. One of the things, so basically I'm not answering the question because I don't really know exactly how to respond to that. And I should probably just quit there. We do have to watch out for trade-offs, and also we need to be a little careful about, one event. Now, of course, one big snowmelt event in northern regions, which, I don't deal with where I am in Indiana, so that's part of the reason I'm not as up on it as I probably should be. One event could be very, very significant, but you also have to look at what the overall year is like, and where I tend to focus my efforts. We have many, many runoff events, and one might be higher, and then the next may be lower. So bottom line is I don't have a direct answer at this moment.
Thank you, Eileen. And obviously the trade-offs that you point out are important, and then maybe, you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I heard that maybe, over the longer term, keeping that sediment in place might get us ahead, even if we have some shorter term dissolved phosphorus losses.
Well, certainly keeping the sediment, I mean, in my opinion, keeping the sediment on the soil, on the field, has still got to be our primary concern, because, you know, once sediment gets into the stream, then it's a reservoir for a long, long time in the stream. So you can put perfectly clear water in the stream, and if you have a sediment bank, you're going to be desorbing phosphorus. So as long, you know, if we keep adding sediment, we're just prolonging that source in our streams for even longer. So I do think that sediment is the primary thing for us to control. Dissolved comes second, in my opinion.
Thank you. And a question from Brittany for Dean. Do you think that cover crops would be as effective in coordination with rotational grazing?
They've been doing considerable work here at MSU looking at that, and they're seeing some big advantages using annual cover crops in a rotational grazing system, particularly to offset the summer slump that you often see in pastures, and it actually allows your pastures to recover better so that they're again available in the fall. And from some of the data that I've seen, weight gain is as good, if not better. I would point you to the work being done by Jason Roundtree. That's R-O-W-N-T-R-E-E at Michigan State University. He's done considerable work with looking at cover crops in rotational grazing systems.
Great, thank you. And the question from Lindsay: what is the best time point to measure biomass of cover crops for comparison? Is once in late fall and again before termination enough?
I'm going to jump in on that one. That's what I do for my research. We measure it as late in the fall as possible. We try to catch it, you know, like right before there's a killing frost for whatever it is you're growing. But of course, you can't always do that. So late fall, and then again we try to measure it as close as possible to termination in the spring. I think for comparisons of cover crops, that's great. If you want to go into more detail about growth curves and things like that, you could certainly do it. But we just, as a standard, do those 2 times. And I must say that a lot of times in the fall, depending on what the cover crop is, we may or may not actually sample it, because if it's cereal rye, a lot of times it's only about 2 inches tall. I kind of have a threshold for my own work of 3 inches. If it's not at least 3 inches tall, we don't sample it. We take a photo of it. We make observations, but we don't actually sample it, just because of the error of how close can you cut it with the scissors in your frame, and are you going to be consistent, and so on. But I don't know if Dean has a different opinion on that or not, but that's my...
Yeah, that's pretty much the same thing that we do here. We try to get as close to the killing frost pretty late in the season as possible, but like Eileen said, you can't always guess on that, so sometimes you're a little earlier. And then we also measure it just prior to termination, whatever method we're going to use.
Okay, great. So I have a question, and what do you see as the biggest challenges that we're facing right now in terms of broader cover crop adoption? Are they research challenges? Are they outreach challenges? If they're research challenges, what are the questions that you're particularly interested in right now? So what do you see as the biggest challenges facing us right now in cover crop adoption?
You want me to jump in on this one, Eileen?
Yeah, why don't you start, Dean?
Okay. I like to, from what I've seen in the, definitely the past few years, is I like to say I think most farmers have drank the tea, or the Kool-Aid or whatever. You're hard-pressed to find farmers out there who don't believe that cover crops aren't good for soil health and the environment and those types of things. So I think a lot of our education in the past has been kind of focused on trying to convince farmers that they're good. And I think we've kind of started moving into an era now where they're saying, okay, I believe you, but how do I make them work in my system? And so I think that's kind of the future of a lot of our interaction with farmers, is helping them figure out how to fit them in their system, what cover crops to use for their goals, just kind of being cover crop consultants to a certain extent, and helping them build their confidence in their ability to use cover crops.
And I would agree with Dean that most farmers understand that cover crops will be beneficial. I would say, though, that there's still a number of them that are not convinced they will be beneficial enough economically for them to bother with it, because it is, an additional management challenge. And the economic benefits over the short term in many cases are not there. So then you've got the issue of, yeah, I'd like to do it, but it costs me money, and you're telling me I'm not actually going to see any economic benefit for maybe 5 years, and so how am I going to make that work? So I do think that is a challenge. Some of that is just the way cover crops are and how soil is, and it's not going to be faster. Some of it is research and research broadly defined there, to somehow quantify some of those other intangibles in a way that a farmer can kind of get their arms around. So we have a number of farmer cooperators who have their own kind of case study on how they do the economics, and some people really like that and are convinced by that, and that includes, they don't have to use as they're substituting cover crops for tillage. Okay, so some of the farmers talk about that. Some of the farmers talk about what Dean was talking about with water, that that extra inch of water in August in a dry year is worth a lot. But those are hard to put hard numbers on. So I do think we still have that issue, and I also think we still have the issue of just practicality of how in the heck do I get this thing seeded in a timely way enough that I get enough benefit.
Yep. Great. Anna, anything to add?
I think they did a great job covering it. I don't think I have anything to add to that. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, unless there are any further questions from our participants, thank you so much to Eileen, Dean, and Anna for great presentations. And here is their contact information for you if you would like to follow up with them. You can email them or give them a call. And this session, as well as other webinars that we have done, are archived at northcentralwater.org, and for e-extension at learn.extension.org. So you can see these again anytime, or share them with folks that were not able to attend in person. So we certainly welcome that. And our next webinar, these webinars are always on the second Wednesday of the month at 2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern, and we look forward to having you again. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.